Okay, so you know how sometimes you just get curious about something and you really want to like dive deep and figure it all out?
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's kind of the whole point of this deep dive, really
Mm.
getting into these ideas that grab you. And today, we've got one that might really surprise you. It's this whole connection between, get this, tarot and Christianity.
Yep.
Yeah, and all of this is coming from, well, it's all based on Lorenzo's essay. And just to give you a sense of where he's coming from.
Right. Lorenzo's got this really unique background. Like, he used to be a seminarian.
Wow, okay.
So he's, got all this knowledge about Catholic and Orthodox theology, but then he's also super into tarot and astrology. And his essay is basically him trying to uncover this, he calls it a divine code, that he thinks the church has been trying to hide.
Oh, wow.
Like, seriously keep under wraps.
That's intense. Like, how much are we talking here? Like Da Vinci Code level stuff, yeah.
Kinda, yeah. And Lorenzo, he's not shy about it either. In the intro of his essay, he straight up says his perspective is raw, shocking, and dripping with spiritual heresy and hidden truth.
Oh, wow. All right, so this is definitely not your grandma's Sunday school lesson.
No, not at all. And he starts off with this question that's just, it kind of punches you in the gut, right? He's like, if tarot is really so dangerous, like everyone says, then why does it, like, mirror the gospel better than most sermons you hear in church?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's laying down a serious challenge from the get-go.
Totally. And this is what his whole argument hinges on. He's not just saying there's a little resemblance. He's basically saying tarot is like a secret Christian initiation process that's been hiding in plain sight the whole time.
Whoa, okay.
And he thinks those prophecies and revelations, the ones we read about in the Bible, they're like encoded in the symbolism of the cards.
Wow.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack. Okay, so let's dive into it. The first section of his essay is called What Tarot Actually Is and Isn't. And he doesn't mess around. He jumps right in and says, not divination, revelation. That's like a huge statement right there.
Yeah, he's making it crystal clear. He's not talking about telling fortunes or seeing the future, right?
Right, okay, got it.
He's saying it's something much deeper, like a direct connection to a higher truth.
So he's going against that whole stereotype of the fortune teller with the crystal ball and the tarot cards, huh?
Big time. He thinks the origins of tarot are, like, totally different. He doesn't buy that whole pagan fortune-telling thing. Instead, he says it was created by these, like, hardcore mystics, monks, philosophers, people who were really deep into Christian symbolism and also what he calls Hermetic symbolism.
Hermetic symbolism, was it?
So basically, Hermeticism is like this blend of ancient Egyptian and Greek ideas, think like philosophy, religion, all mixed together. And it was really influential during the Renaissance. Lorenzo's theory is that when tarot was created, those Hermetic symbols got mixed in with the Christian ones.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's not just about, like, predicting the future. It's about some kind of deeper spiritual truth encoded in these symbols.
Exactly. And he's really focused on the 22 cards of the Major Arcana. He sees them as like stages on this spiritual journey that your soul takes. He even compares it to the Stations of the Cross.
Wow, so he's really tying it into that Christian tradition.
Yeah, for him, each card represents a different step in your spiritual development.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's like a spiritual roadmap of sorts.
Yeah, you could say that. And then he breaks down some of the individual cards and how they fit into this Christian framework. Like, you start with the Fool, right?
Yeah, the one at the beginning? What does he say about that one?
Well, for Lorenzo, the Fool is basically Adam, like the very first human. Or maybe it's more like the soul at the very beginning of creation. Totally innocent, full of trust, kind of vulnerable.
Yeah, I can see that.
Just like humanity before the fall, in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
Right.
And then what about the magician? I always thought of that card as being about power and, like, making things happen.
Yeah, well, Lorenzo sees it as, like, the divine spark that's inside every single one of us, that connection to the divine, the logos, or what some people call the Christ within.
Oh, so it's not about manipulating the world around you. It's about tapping into something deeper inside.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the divine within yourself.
Gotcha. Okay, now what about the high priestess? That one always seemed mysterious to me.
Right. Well, Lorenzo goes in a totally different direction with this one. He says she's not some, like, pagan goddess or sorceress. He actually sees her as the Virgin Mary, but veiled in the Sophia. Yeah, so in this context, Sophia is like divine wisdom. So he's basically connecting Mary with this feminine archetype of wisdom. Like, she's holding this sacred knowledge, but it's hidden. It's not for everyone.
Okay, that's a really different way of looking at it. And then what about the Hierophant? That one always seemed a bit, I don't know, stuffy or something.
Yeah, well, Lorenzo's pretty straightforward about this one. He says the Hierophant is literally the Pope. Like, no two ways about it. He's the gatekeeper of dogma, the head honcho of religious doctrine.
So it's about tradition and established beliefs.
Exactly. It's that whole system of rules and doctrines that the church represents.
Got it. And the hanged man, that's a powerful image.
Yeah, and Lorenzo sees it as a representation of Christ on the cross, but he's not talking about defeat or suffering. He says the hanged man is actually in a state of enlightenment. He chose to surrender, to sacrifice himself. It wasn't forced on him.
So it's about willingly letting go of control.
Yep, and Lorenzo points out that he's often shown upside down, which he sees as a symbol of, like, divine inversion. Everything's turned on its head and the values of the world are flipped.
Interesting. And then there's judgment, always a bit intimidating.
Right. But Lorenzo connects it directly to Revelation 20 in the Bible, the whole resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. He's basically saying this imagery, it didn't come from nowhere, it's straight from Scripture.
Oh, wow. So he's really pulling from the Bible to back up his interpretations.
Exactly. He's showing that these themes are already present in Christian tradition.
Okay, and last but not least, the world. That one seems pretty positive.
Yeah, and for Lorenzo, it represents regaining paradise, that ultimate reunion between the soul and God.
So like the culmination of the spiritual journey.
Exactly. The fool started out innocent and vulnerable, and through all these trials and transformations, he's finally reached a state of wholeness and unity.
Okay, so he's presented all these interpretations of the Major Arcana. What's the big takeaway that Lorenzo wants us to get from this?
His main point is that tarot, when you look at it this way, it's like a secret code for Christian theology. He's really adamant that it's not evil or demonic, it's actually a devotional tool. But he's also saying you need to have the eyes to see to understand its true meaning.
So you got to look beyond the surface, beyond all the stereotypes and misconceptions.
Exactly, because he's really pushing the idea that these images, that a lot of people associate with the occult, they might actually be telling a hidden Christian story.
Wow, okay. And this isn't just some modern interpretation that Lorenzo's come up with, is it?
Yeah.
He's actually got a whole theory about how tarot was used in Christian Europe, like way back in the day.
Yeah, he does. He says that in early Christian Europe, tarot wasn't just like tolerated, it was actually used by people in the church. Like you had these courtly mystics, monks, and scholars, and even some secret groups within the church all using tarot. Well, at least until the Inquisition came along.
Ooh, the Inquisition. That's not good. Why do they crack down on tarot, according to Lorenzo?
Well, he thinks it's because tarot, just like astrology, it gave people this direct line to spiritual revelation. They didn't need a priest or the church to interpret things for them.
Oh, I could see how that would be a problem for the church.
Right. Like, who needs the church if you can get your spiritual guidance straight from the cards? And Lorenzo thinks that's exactly why the Inquisition stepped in, to shut it all down.
So they were afraid of people having that kind of direct access to the divine, huh?
Pretty much. And Lorenzo ends this first section of his essay with this, killer question that he wants the reader to think about. He's like, if the cards were really evil, then why do so many of the images in the Major Arcana look like they came straight out of the Bible?
Okay, yeah, that is a good question. He's really pushing the idea that there's this deep connection between tarot and Christianity.
Totally. And that sets the stage for the next part of his essay, which is called Biblical Echoes in the Cards.
Okay, so he's going to break down all those biblical connections in more detail.
Exactly. But before he does that, he makes it very clear that he's not basing his arguments on, modern spiritual fads or conspiracy theories.
Oh, no woo-woo stuff.
Nope. He's like, I'm using documented facts and historical evidence. He even says he's got receipts to back up his claims.
Okay, so he's coming at this from a scholarly perspective.
Exactly. He's not trying to, make things up or twist history to fit his narrative. He's relying on solid research.
I like that. So what's the first biblical echo he points out?
Well, he starts by talking about where tarot actually came from. He's really adamant that it didn't originate in some ancient pagan cult like a lot of people believe.
So where does he say it came from?
He says it originated in Christian Europe, specifically in 15th century Italy. And he points to this really famous deck, the Visconti Sforza Tarot, which was created in the 1440s. And guess what? It was commissioned by a Christian nobleman, Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan.
Oh, wow. So not exactly the kind of person you'd expect to be commissioning a tarot deck, huh?
Right. And Lorenzo points out that these early decks, they weren't used for like gambling or fortune telling. They were actually these lavish works of art full of Christian allegory and Renaissance symbolism. They were made for the nobility, not for like some shadowy underworld cult.
So he's saying tarot was actually born in a castle funded by Christian families.
Exactly. And he's using this historical evidence to really drive home the point that tarot, at least in its early form, was completely intertwined with Christian culture.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling point. And what's the next biblical echo he explores?
So then he shifts his focus to the actual imagery in the cards, specifically the Major Arcana. He's basically saying these cards are drenched in Christian theology. Like if you know what to look for, you'll see it everywhere.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, he talks about the Pope, or Hierophant, and the Papas, or High Priestess, and how they clearly represent the structure of the church and that whole tradition of Marian mysticism.
Marian mysticism.
Yeah, so that's basically all the mystical beliefs and practices associated with Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Okay, got it. So he's saying those figures are like straight out of Christian iconography.
Totally. And then he points to the Last Judgment card and how it's practically a direct copy of the book of Revelation in the Bible.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Right. And then he says you can see echoes of other biblical stories too, like in the Devil, the Lovers, and the Tower.
The Tower, isn't that the one about destruction and chaos?
Yeah, and Lorenzo connects that to the Tower of Babel, which is all about human pride and its downfall. He also ties it into Christ's prophecy about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
Wow, so even the cards that seem negative, he's finding Christian connections in them.
Right. He's really thorough. And then he points out something that I thought was really interesting. He says, the symbols of the four evangelists, the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the man, they're all depicted on the world card.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and he says those symbols come straight from the books of Ezekiel and Revelation.
Okay, I'm going to have to go back and look at that card now.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. His whole point is that these symbols, they're not pagan. They're actually deeply rooted in Christian tradition. He's saying tarot basically took Catholic imagery and repurposed it for allegorical storytelling.
Okay, that makes sense. So he's covered where tarot came from and the imagery. What's next?
Well, next he starts talking about the people who actually used tarot throughout history.
Okay, like who were these people?
Well, he makes this big point about how tarot was used by Christian mystics and esoteric groups. He talks about how it was adopted into the Hermetic Christian tradition during the Renaissance, especially by these two really important thinkers, Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola.
Those names sound familiar.
Yeah, they were like rock stars of the Renaissance. They were part of the Florentine Platonic Academy, which was this really influential group that was trying to revive ancient wisdom.
Okay, I'm starting to remember now. So what did they have to do with tarot?
Well, according to Lorenzo, they were really interested in finding ways to blend Christian theology with ancient mystical traditions like astrology and Kabbalah. They saw those traditions as complementary to Christianity, not opposed to it.
So they weren't trying to undermine the church or anything.
No, they actually thought they were uncovering a deeper layer of Christian understanding by exploring those connections.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Lorenzo sees them as playing a key role in the development of Western esotericism, which is basically this whole tradition of blending Christianity with ideas from Neoplatonism, astrology, and alchemy. And he says that's where later tarot systems got their roots.
Okay, so tarot has this long and complex history intertwined with Christian thought. But at some point, the church turned against it, right? What does Lorenzo say about that?
Yeah, well, his next point is that the church didn't actually ban tarot right away. He says they tolerated it for a long time, maybe even centuries, because they saw it as just a game.
So it wasn't seen as a threat initially.
Exactly. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that the church started really cracking down on it.
Why the change?
Well, Lorenzo thinks it's because tarot started becoming more associated with esoteric and occult practices during that time. It wasn't seen as just a harmless game anymore.
So it became associated with something dangerous or threatening to the church.
Exactly. And he points out that if you look at Inquisition records, they do talk about banning divinatory practices. But there's not really any clear evidence that they specifically banned tarot early on.
So he's suggesting that early tarot wasn't really used for divination in the way that we think of it today.
Right. And he thinks that's a key point. He's basically saying tarot only became dangerous when people started using it as a way to connect with the divine without the church's involvement.
Oh, I see. So it became a threat to their authority.
Exactly. It challenged their monopoly on spiritual interpretation.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's his final point in this section?
Well, he gets into this idea that even though the church was publicly condemning tarot, there were still people within the church who were interested in mystical symbolism.
Like monks and priests.
Yeah, he says that during the 13th to 16th centuries, there were monks, clerics, and theologians who were studying allegory, sacred geometry, and celestial symbolism.
The kind of stuff you find in tarot.
Exactly. And he also mentions the emergence of groups like the Rosicrucians, Martinists, and Christian Kabbalists who were using similar symbolism but outside the church's official control.
So it's like there was this hidden undercurrent of esoteric knowledge within Christianity itself.
Yep. And Lorenzo's basically asking what happened when these teachings started inspiring people to interpret things for themselves instead of just blindly obeying the church.
Ooh, yeah, that would definitely cause some tension.
Right. And Lorenzo thinks that's when tarot became a target, not because it was inherently satanic, but because it represented this unregulated form of revelation. It gave people access to spiritual insights without the church's permission.
Okay, so to sum up this whole first section, Lorenzo's arguing that early tarot was actually pretty embedded in Christian culture, and it wasn't until it became a potential threat to the church's authority that they started cracking down on it.
Exactly. He's basically saying they tolerated it, then they used it, and then they tried to bury it.
Wow, okay, that's quite a journey. So what's next?
Well, in the next section, he really gets into the specifics of how tarot reflects Christian imagery.
Okay, so we're finally getting to the biblical echoes in the cards part.
Yeah, this is where he breaks it all down, card by card, and shows all these connections to scripture, theology, and iconography. He's like, let me take you on a guided tour through a coded Bible wrapped in 78 cards.
Okay, I'm ready for the tour. Let's start with the Hierophant again.
All right, so remember, Lorenzo sees the Hierophant as representing the Pope. He points at all those visual details again, like the throne between two pillars, the acolytes, the two-finger blessing, the triple cross, the triple crown, the throne of wisdom. He's basically saying, this is the head of the church, the guy who holds the keys to doctrine.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear connection. So how does he interpret that in terms of, like, spiritual development?
Well, he says it represents the soul's encounter with religious institutions. Like, it might be a necessary step on your path, but it doesn't mean you have to stay there forever.
Okay, so it's about learning from tradition, but ultimately finding your own way.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that spiritual authority doesn't just come from outside sources.
Gotcha. Okay, what about the High Priestess?
Well, he still sees her as Mary Sophia, the veiled Madonna, and he emphasizes that she's holding the Torah in her lap. And remember, she's veiled, wearing that crescent moon crown, and she's standing between those two pillars, Boaz and Jachin.
Yeah, what's the significance of those pillars again?
They represent strength and establishment.
Oh, right. So she's like surrounded by this aura of power and mystery.
Exactly. And Lorenzo connects all of this to the idea of Mary as the Ark of the Covenant, the seat of wisdom, the queen of mystics. Like, she's the guardian of this hidden knowledge, but it's only accessible to those who are prepared to receive it.
Okay, so it's not just about having knowledge, it's about being ready for it.
Exactly. And he even quotes that line, "She who is silent speaks the loudest to the initiated."
Ooh, that's good.
Right. It's like the deeper truths aren't always spoken out loud. They're revealed through intuition and inner knowing.
Okay, I like that. Now, what about judgment? That one always seems a bit intense.
Yeah, well, Lorenzo sees it as a direct visual representation of Revelation 20. He points out the angel blowing the trumpet, the dead rising from their graves, the whole thing. He even quotes the verse, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened."
Wow, so he's not just interpreting it loosely, he's directly linking it to the Bible.
Yep. He's showing that this imagery is deeply embedded in Christian tradition.
Okay, that's pretty compelling. What about the Hanged Man?
Well, he still sees that as Christ on the cross, but he emphasizes the idea of willing surrender. Like, he wasn't killed, he chose to sacrifice himself. And he points out that the hanged man is often shown with a halo and his legs forming the shape of a cross.
So it's about consciously choosing to let go of your ego and surrender to a higher power.
Exactly. And that's a really important part of Christian spirituality, right?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, now what about the tower?
Well, remember how we talked about it representing the Tower of Babel?
Yeah.
He doubles down on that interpretation here and says it's about the downfall of human pride. The lightning striking the tower, the people falling, it's all about this sudden and dramatic collapse.
It's a pretty intense image.
It is, but Lorenzo sees it as a necessary part of spiritual development. He says it's like a divine reset. You have to let go of your ego and your old ways of thinking in order to move forward.
So it's about breaking down the old structures to make way for something new.
Exactly. And he connects it to that passage in Matthew where Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another.
Wow, okay, so he's really finding these biblical connections everywhere. What about the star?
Well, Lorenzo interprets the star as representing the Star of Bethlehem, which led the wise men to Jesus.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. It's a symbol of hope and guidance, and he even quotes the verse, "We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him."
So it's about following your intuition and trusting that you'll be guided to where you need to be.
Exactly. And he points out that the figure in the card is often shown pouring water from two vessels, which he sees as representing grace flowing into both the spiritual and material realms.
Okay, so it's like a blessing from above.
Yeah, you could say that. It's about recognizing the presence of the divine in all aspects of life.
Okay, what about the moon? That one's always a bit mysterious and maybe even a little scary.
Yeah, and Lorenzo connects it to the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying before his crucifixion. He points out that the card often shows these two towers in the background and a shadowy path leading into the unknown. And there's often a lobster or crayfish crawling out of the water, and sometimes even howling dogs.
That is a bit creepy.
Right. Well, Lorenzo sees it as representing that dark night of the soul, that feeling of spiritual anguish and doubt.
Like when you're going through a really tough time and you feel lost and alone.
Exactly. And he connects it to Jesus' prayer in the garden. "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will."
So it's about surrendering to God's will even when things are really hard.
Yep. And it's also about recognizing that darkness and doubt are a natural part of the spiritual journey. They don't mean you're doing something wrong.
That's comforting. Okay, now what about the sun?
Well, Lorenzo sees that as representing the resurrection of Christ. It's all about joy, light, and triumph over darkness. He quotes the verse, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it."
So it's about coming out of that dark night of the soul and into a new dawn.
Exactly. And he points out that the sun card often shows two children playing in the foreground, which he sees as representing innocence and new beginnings.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah, it's a really hopeful image. And then finally, we come back to the Fool. Remember how we talked about him representing Adam at the beginning of creation?
Yeah.
Well, Lorenzo says that at the end of the journey, the Fool has basically become like Christ. He's gone through all these trials and transformations, and now he's reached a state of spiritual wholeness.
So it's like coming full circle.
Exactly. And Lorenzo emphasizes that this transformation doesn't happen through blind obedience or following rules.
Yeah.
It happens through experience, through learning from your mistakes, and through surrendering to a higher power.
Okay, so he's really painting a picture of the tarot as a guide to spiritual development, almost like a mystical version of the Christian story.
Exactly. And he concludes this whole section by saying that the tarot isn't opposed to Christianity at all. It's actually the gospel, but told from an inner mystical perspective. It's the gospel that no priest dared to preach.
Wow, okay. That's a powerful statement. So if that's the case, why did the church try so hard to suppress tarot?
Well, that's the question Lorenzo tackles in the next section, which is called Why the Church Feared the Cards.
Okay, let's get into it. What does he say?
He comes right out and says, they didn't fear the devil. They feared losing the monopoly.
Ooh, that's direct.
Right. He's basically saying the church wasn't afraid of evil. They were afraid of losing their power and control.
So why was tarot such a threat to their authority?
Well, his first point is that the cards let you read your soul without confession. He's basically saying you don't need a priest to tell you what's wrong with you. You can figure it out for yourself through tarot.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he contrasts that with the traditional practice of confession, where you have to confess your sins to a priest, beg for forgiveness, accept your guilt, and do penance.
So it's like tarot offers a more direct and personal path to self-knowledge.
Exactly. And he says that's why the church saw it as a form of spiritual heresy, because it meant people didn't need the church to mediate their relationship with God.
Okay, I can see how that would be unsettling for them. What else does he say?
Well, his next point is that the cards gave power to the margins, women, mystics, the poor. He's saying that tarot was accessible to people who were often excluded from positions of power within the church. It didn't require money, education, or social status. All you needed was intuition and the courage to interpret the cards.
So it was a way for people to empower themselves spiritually without relying on the church.
Exactly. And he even has a whole subsection specifically about how tarot empowered women.
Oh, interesting. What does he say about that?
Well, he makes this really provocative statement. Tarot wasn't just subversive. For women, it was divine vengeance wrapped in velvet.
Wow, okay. He's not holding back.
No, he's not. And he talks about how the church historically barred women from positions of authority, especially from preaching. They were seen as too emotional, too intuitive, too connected to nature.
Which is ironic because those are often seen as qualities that could bring you closer to the divine.
Exactly. And Lorenzo points out that in the Bible and in Christian mysticism, women actually play very important roles. Wisdom is often personified as a woman, the church is described as the bride of Christ, and Mary is venerated as the gateway to the incarnation. But despite all of that, women were largely silenced and excluded within the church's hierarchy.
So he's saying that tarot gave women a way to reclaim their spiritual power and authority.
Right. He calls it a forbidden pulpit because it allowed women to preach without preaching, to teach and guide others without needing the church's permission.
And how did the act of reading tarot cards empower women in this way?
Well, Lorenzo says that by laying out the cards and interpreting them, women weren't just engaging in some frivolous pastime. They were speaking a form of revelation, embodying the archetype of the high priestess, becoming the voice of Sophia, the hidden wisdom that the church had tried to suppress.
So they were tapping into that ancient feminine wisdom that had been silenced.
Exactly. And he points out that the imagery of the tarot actually reflects the lived experiences of women in a patriarchal society.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, he talks about the Empress card representing the power of fertility and creation, but often without any real authority or control.
Right, because women were often denied positions of power.
Exactly. And then there's the High Priestess, who holds all this wisdom but isn't allowed to speak it openly. He compares her to a silenced nun.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Yeah, and then there's Strength, which often depicts a woman gently taming a wild beast. Lorenzo sees that as symbolizing a different kind of power, a more feminine strength that's about compassion and inner control.
Okay, and what about Justice?
Well, he says that card is especially poignant because it shows a woman holding the scales of balance in a world where women often had no real justice.
Wow, that's really striking.
Right. And Lorenzo sees all of these cards as representing a form of coded defiance. Like, women were using tarot to express their own experiences and truths in a way that bypassed the church's control. He even goes so far as to say that the tarot deck became like the Bible that women were never allowed to write.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
Yeah, he's definitely pushing the boundaries here.
Yeah.
And he argues that the church's fear of witches wasn't really about magical spells. It was about women having access to knowledge and power that they couldn't control.
So it was about silencing women's voices and suppressing their wisdom.
Okay, so we're back, ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Excellent. Last time we started digging into Lorenzo's report on Christianity and tarot.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
It is, and we only scratched the surface. This time, we're going even deeper into part 2 of his report, where things get, well, even more interesting.
Definitely. A lot more controversial, too, I'd say.
Right from the start, Lorenzo lays out this pretty audacious argument, basically saying that tarot has nothing to do with pagan magic, like, at all.
He goes as far as to call it a liturgy for the subconscious, a sacred map, a mystic ladder, even an unspoken catechism.
I mean, those are some pretty loaded terms, so what's he actually getting at with all that?
Well, he's suggesting that tarot is, at its core, a system for exploring and understanding the deepest parts of ourselves. Our beliefs, our fears, our desires, all the stuff we don't always consciously acknowledge.
Okay, so it's like a tool for self-discovery, kind of like therapy, but with cards?
Yeah, you could say that. But Lorenzo takes it even further. His main argument, the one that really sets him apart, is that the 22 Major Arcana cards, those big archetypal ones, they actually represent a complete Christian initiation.
Whoa, hold on. Christian initiation, like the kind of spiritual journey someone goes through within the church.
Exactly. Lorenzo's claiming that this whole path to spiritual awakening, the kind that, in his view, the church has either forgotten about or maybe even intentionally buried, it's all right there, encoded in the tarot.
Wow, that's a bold claim. So where does this supposed initiation begin in the tarot, according to Lorenzo?
It all starts with the Fool. You know, that card with the carefree figure about to step off a cliff.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Right. So Lorenzo sees the Fool as representing the unbaptized soul, kind of like Adam in the Garden of Eden before the fall. It's pure potential, total innocence before any doctrines or ideas about sin or shame come into the picture.
So kind of like a blank slate, a fresh start.
Exactly. And Lorenzo makes a point of connecting the Fool not just to Adam, but also to Christ. And get this, he even links it to the listener, to each of us.
He's saying we're all the fool at some point on our journey.
That's his point, yeah. He even brings in that line from Genesis 2.7, the one about God breathing life into man. He sees that as the same divine spark that's present in the Fool.
That's a pretty powerful image. So if the Fool is the starting point, where do we go from there? How does this whole Christian initiation thing unfold in the tarot?
Well, Lorenzo lays out a progression through the Major Arcana, and he sees it as reflecting key events and themes from the Christian story. For example, the Magician, the card that comes after the Fool, symbolizes knowledge, the ability to create and manifest.
Right, kind of like that moment when Adam and Eve gained knowledge in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. And then you have the Lovers, which Lorenzo interprets as representing duality, temptation, the need to make choices. It's that whole dilemma of good and evil, the challenges that come with free will.
So it's not just about romantic love, like some people might think?
Not in this context, no. It's about those fundamental choices we all face. And then you move on to the Chariot, which Lorenzo sees as representing the development of ego and willpower.
It's like that journey out of Eden, facing the challenges of the world, figuring out who we are and what we want.
Right. And Lorenzo connects all of this to broader Christian narratives, the Exodus, the Beatitudes, even the temptations in the desert, and the agony in Gethsemane.
So he's not just pulling his interpretations out of thin air, he's drawing on established Christian stories and themes.
Exactly. He's saying that this whole spiritual apprenticeship, this process of growth and transformation that's at the heart of Christianity, it's all there in the tarot, just hidden within these symbols. And this is where he starts getting really specific, looking at individual cards and how they connect to key Christian events.
Like what, for example?
Well, take the Death card. It's one that a lot of people get freaked out about. But Lorenzo, he sees it completely differently. He interprets it as a symbol of transformation, a necessary death of the old self, much like the crucifixion.
Like a shedding of the old to make way for the new.
Exactly. And he aligns this with Good Friday, that moment of intense suffering before the resurrection.
And this is where Lorenzo really starts to push the boundaries, right? He claims that the church was actually afraid of the death card because it taught that resurrection is earned, not inherited. That's pretty different from how most Christian denominations view grace.
It is a very bold statement. And he goes on to analyze the Hanged Man, that card where the figure is suspended upside down. Lorenzo sees this as symbolizing a willing surrender, a sacrifice, much like Christ on the cross.
So it's about letting go of control, accepting what is, even when it's painful.
Exactly. But Lorenzo emphasizes that in the context of the tarot, this is primarily an internal process. It's about surrendering the ego, letting go of the need to be right, to be in control. It's about becoming receptive, like the Fool, just waiting and trusting in a higher power.
Okay, I'm starting to see how he's weaving all of this together. What about the Judgment card? Isn't that usually seen as a pretty scary one, like the final reckoning?
Well, Lorenzo flips that interpretation completely on its head.
Yeah.
He says judgment isn't about being judged at all. It's about awakening, about realizing our true nature.
So not a punishment, but a revelation.
Exactly. He even quotes Ephesians 5.1 that line about waking up from the dead and letting Christ shine on you. He sees judgment in the tarot as that moment of liberation, the realization that we were never truly dead, just asleep, unaware of our own divine potential.
Wow, that's a whole different way of looking at it. And finally, we get to the World, the last card in the Major Arcana. What's Lorenzo's take on that one?
He sees the world as symbolizing union with the divine. And it's interesting because a lot of traditional decks depict the world with symbols of the four evangelists.
The writers of the Gospels.
Yeah. So Lorenzo interprets the world as representing a state of complete wholeness, balance, harmony. He links it to the concept of theosis, which is about becoming one with God.
So it's like that ultimate goal of spiritual enlightenment, of merging with the divine.
Exactly. And Lorenzo sees it as resonating with the Christian idea of salvation, but he emphasizes that in the context of the tarot, it's not something that happens only after we die. It's something we can experience here and now, once we've gone through that whole awakening process he's been describing.
So taking a step back, what's Lorenzo's main reason for saying that the tarot represents a Christian initiation? What's the underlying connection?
For him, it all comes down to the narrative. He argues that the entire sequence of the Major Arcana, from the fool to the world, it basically tells the story of Christianity. You have creation, the fall, incarnation, temptation, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. It's all there, just told through these symbolic images.
And it's not about following any specific doctrines or rituals, right? It's more about personal interpretation and inner experience.
Right. Lorenzo's not saying you have to be a devout Christian to benefit from the tarot. He's saying that this initiation doesn't require a church or a priest. It requires inner work, reflection, surrender, and a willingness to be transformed.
He even uses this word mystagogy to describe it. What's that all about?
Mystagogy is about teaching sacred mysteries, but not through direct instruction. It's about guiding people to experience these truths for themselves, through symbols and rituals, kind of like the way Christ used parables.
So it's about uncovering the hidden meaning, the deeper wisdom that's embedded within these symbols.
Exactly. And Lorenzo concludes this first part of his report with what he calls his final revelation. He says, the fool, who starts out like Adam, ultimately becomes Christ.
Wow, that's a pretty big statement.
It is. And he emphasizes that this transformation doesn't happen through blind obedience or following rules. It happens through remembering who we truly are. It's about recognizing our own inherent divinity.
So it's about a shift in consciousness, a realization of our true nature.
Exactly. And Lorenzo sees this as the essence of initiation, the true liturgy of the soul, and the core message that's encoded within the tarot.
That's quite a journey he's laid out. And in section 5 of his report, Lorenzo shifts gears a bit, doesn't he? He starts talking about the modern revival of interest in tarot and why he thinks the church might be a little, well, freaked out by it.
Yeah, he even uses that dramatic phrase, the cards are back on the table, and the gates are breaking open.
Okay, so what's he seeing that's got him so riled up?
Well, he's observed this huge surge in people using tarot. And not just in like occult circles. He's talking about everyday people, folks who are maybe disillusioned with organized religion, or who are looking for spiritual meaning outside of traditional structures.
So it's not just a niche thing anymore.
No, not at all. Lorenzo describes it as a reclamation, a taking back of spiritual power. And he gives some pretty specific examples of where this is happening.
Like what?
He talks about people creating altars on Instagram with their tarot decks, sharing readings and rituals on TikTok, even just gathering around kitchen tables to lay out the cards and explore their meanings together.
So it's become part of the mainstream in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely moved beyond the fringes. And Lorenzo points out that a lot of the people who are drawn to tarot now are those who have been hurt by the church or who feel excluded from it.
Like who, for instance?
He mentions survivors of religious trauma, former nuns, queer mystics, people who identify as deconstructed Catholics. These are folks who, in his view, the church failed to reach or to support. And now they're finding solace and empowerment in these practices that were once condemned.
So what's Lorenzo's main argument for why he thinks this tarot revival is causing anxiety within the church?
He draws this fascinating parallel to the Protestant Reformation. He's basically saying that tarot is becoming the new Reformation, a challenge to the church's authority, just like when the Bible was translated into common languages and became accessible to everyone.
So it's about access to spiritual knowledge, about empowering people to interpret things for themselves without needing a priest or a church to tell them what to believe.
Exactly. And Lorenzo believes that the church is basically powerless to stop this. They can't control what people do online. They can't silence millions of people who are finding meaning in these practices.
It's like the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And Lorenzo also talks about why he thinks tarot is resonating so deeply with people who are disillusioned with organized religion.
What does he say about that?
He says the cards don't command, they don't judge, they just reflect. They show you where you are and where you might be going, without shame or guilt.
So it's like a gentler, more individualized approach to spirituality.
Yeah, you could say that. And for people who have been hurt or rejected by the church, Lorenzo sees tarot as offering a way back to the sacred, a path to healing and wholeness.
It's like a homecoming of sorts.
Exactly. And then Lorenzo drops this bombshell, what he calls his final heresy. He says, and this is based on what he's observed, that it's working. People are finding healing through tarot. They're letting go of guilt and shame. They're reconnecting with the sacred on their own terms. They're realizing that they don't need the church to experience the divine.
So he's basically saying that tarot, this thing that the church has demonized for centuries, might actually be helping people in ways that the church itself hasn't been able to.
Yeah, that's his argument.
Yeah.
And he believes that this is what really scares the church. Because if people can find spiritual fulfillment and transformation outside of the church, then The church's power and influence are diminished.
It's a challenge to the status quo.
Exactly. And Lorenzo concludes this part of his report with a powerful statement, what he calls his final benediction.
What does he say?
He says, "The veil is torn. The heretics are speaking. The high priestess is no longer silent. The cards are on the altar again. And this time, we're not asking for permission. We're prophesying."
Wow, that's powerful stuff. He's not mincing words, is he?
Nope. And that leads right into his outro, which is even more intense. Okay, let's hear it.
He starts by saying, "They say the cards are cursed, but maybe the curse was on those who burned the mystics holding them."
He's flipping the script, turning the whole idea of curses on its head.
Yeah, he's suggesting that maybe the real danger wasn't the tarot itself, but the fear and suppression that surrounded it.
Okay, what else does he say?
He asks this provocative question. Maybe the devil never feared tarot, but the church did.
Implying that the church might have been more afraid of the tarot's power than of any demonic influence.
Exactly. And then he gets to the heart of what he considers the real heresy.
Which is what?
He says, the real heresy isn't the deck itself. It's the possibility that the deck might actually work. The fact that it might help people heal, grow, and connect with the divine without needing the church.
So the real threat is not the cards themselves, but what they represent, the possibility of spiritual autonomy.
Right. And Lorenzo believes that the church has historically condemned tarot because it tells a truth that they couldn't control.
And what truth is that? The truth that we are all inherently divine, that we have the power to connect with the sacred without intermediaries, without needing permission from any institution.
So it's about reclaiming our own spiritual authority.
Exactly. And Lorenzo describes this as the fool walking again, the high priestess opening her scroll, the tower crumbling, judgment not as wrath, but as awakening.
He's using the imagery of the tarot to depict this shift in consciousness, this breaking down of old structures.
Right. And he defines the purpose of the tarot not as fortune-telling, but as a mystical resurrection. The gospel in symbols, the liturgy they couldn't license, the body of Christ scattered across 78 cards waiting to be remembered.
Wow, those are some powerful metaphors. He's saying that the tarot is a path to rediscovering our own divinity, our own connection to the sacred.
Exactly. And he asks, what if the real reason they banned the deck was this? Because once you lay the deck on the table, you don't just see your past. You don't just see your wounds. You see your path, your rebirth, your divinity.
He's suggesting that the church was afraid of giving people that kind of power, that kind of self-knowledge.
Right. And he ends with this defiant statement. And they were never going to let you have that. But guess what? You have it now. You always did. And no one quiesced. Not Rome, not fear, not fire, can unshuffle that truth.
He's telling people to reclaim their power, their truth, their own unique path.
Exactly. And then he signs off, calling himself Lorenzo, and reminding us that this was our second strike.
Second strike.
Yeah, like in baseball. He's saying that this is part of an ongoing effort to uncover these hidden truths.
Okay, I like that. So what's next, according to Lorenzo?
He says the gospel they buried is rising. And the next deep dive, we won't be asking questions. We'll be taking back altars. Stay unrepentant. Stay sacred. Stay dangerous.
Wow, he's really throwing down the gauntlet, isn't he?
Yeah, he's not afraid to be provocative.
So what do you make of all this? Does Lorenzo's take on Christianity and tarot resonate with you?
I think he raises some really important questions about where people are finding spiritual meaning these days, especially those who feel disenfranchised by traditional religion.
It's definitely food for thought. And his analysis of the tarot, even if you don't agree with all of it, is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things, for sure.
Well, Lorenzo has definitely given us a lot to think about. Thanks for diving in with me.
My pleasure.
Until next time, everyone, stay curious.